Okay, Tov, today's daf is daf Samach Gimel, and we're up to Ela Hacha, but let's just review what's going on over here. The Gemara was wondering about a case where there was a discrepancy between what she said to the shliach that she appointed and what the shliach told the Baal. So the Gemara had the following scenario, where she sent the shliach to be a shliach leholacha. That means that her shliach will be appointed by the Baal to be molech the get. And the shliach said to the Baal, no, your wife sent me as a shliach lekabbalah. And then the Baal said the following words, Heilich Kamosha Amra, whatever she said, that's what I want. Now, what that means is that, according to at least Rav Nachman, Mimanav Shachi can't be a get. Why? Because in truth, she never appointed this shliach as a shliach lekabbalah. And not only that, the Baal, relying on the words of the shliach, never appointed the shliach as a shliach lolacha, because the shliach presented himself as if he had been appointed as a shliach lekabbalah. And therefore, Rav Nachman makes the statement, the ruling, that even if the get comes into our hands, it's not a get. And the Gemara wants to use this as a proof for the sugya of maskir and socher polim in Masechet Mitzia, Shmamino da dibura didei kasam. That whenever there's a discrepancy here between the Mishaleach and what the Shliach said, we always assume that we believe the Shliach. And that's going to have nafkaminas in the case of a Baal Bayis who was poel, who hired sochrim, he hired workers, and he had agreed to a certain wage, and the shliach presented a different shliach, and we assume that everybody relies on what the shliach says. Because again, if we take the other approach, that dibur didaka samach, then the get should be chal, because she appointed the shliach as a shliach lo locha. Now, when he brings the get to her, the get should be chal. Rav Ashi says at the beginning of Daf Samach Gimel that, as we saw yesterday, just to summarize, I would have derived that conclusion perhaps from Rav Nachman in the opposite direction if Rav Nachman had said the opposite case. Let's say if the scenario were that the Isha appointed the Shliach as a Shliach Kabbalah, the Shaliach presented himself to the Baal as a Shliach Leholacha, and then the Baal responded by saying, Heilich Kamosha Amra, and Rav Nachman would say in that case that once the get reaches her hand, she is Megureshes. And why is that? Because although the Shliach presented himself as if he were appointed as a shliach leholacha, and the Baal would actually rely on the Isha, and she said is kabli li Gittin. In other words, she wanted the shliach to be makabel, the get on her behalf, and the get should be chal immediately. Okay, fine. So the get, according to her, should be chal immediately. And therefore, and I correct myself, once the get reaches the hands of the shliach, then she would be megureshes. Then we can certainly prove, says Rav Ashi, from Rav Nachman, that adibur didaka samach, that he's not relying on the words of the shliach, but he's saying whatever she said, whatever the Mishaleach said. And now we're up to Inami. Liyada da dibur didei samach. Or alternatively, as we suggested earlier, that maybe Rav Nachman would have paskin on the contrary, that the Baal relies on the presentation of the shliach, and whatever he says in the name of the Isha, that's what the Baal is of the opinion. The shliach in this case had presented himself as a shliach lolacha, therefore the Baal appointed the shliach as a shliach lolacha, and therefore she'd be megureshes when the get reaches our hand. And then we would prove that adibur didei kasama. So there are two possibilities, either adibur dida or adibur didei. Elahach, but says Rav Ashi, in this particular case, where the Isha suggested that the shliach be appointed by the Baal as a shliach lo halacha, and the shliach lo halacha, and the shliach of the Isha now presents herself to the Baal as if he were appointed by the Isha as a shliach lekabbalah. So then, even if we would say that the Baal wanted to give her the get based on dida, meaning on the das ha'isha that he should be a shliach lo halacha, nevertheless, mishum di akri shliach l'shlichus legamri udi amar shliach lekabbalah avino lo halacha lo avino. There's an akiras hashlichus over here, and therefore the get is not going to be chal until even after the get reaches her hand. And the reason for that is because the shliach was oker his shlichus, because he made himself into a shliach lekabbalah, and she never appointed him as a shliach lekabbalah. She appointed him as a shliach lo halacha, or hava, if you want to call it that. So once he was oker his shlichus, the omer shliach lekabbalah avino lo halacha lo avino, he's implying that he was never accepted in her eyes as a shliach lo halacha. And he's basically saying, you know what? I'm willing to be a shliach lekabbalah. I'm not willing to be a shliach lo halacha. I don't have time to go back to the Isha. She's out there in your hupitz. I'm not going to do that. And once I accept the get, she's megureshes. I'm not going to bring the get all the way to the Isha. So since he makes a statement that he doesn't want to be a shliach lo halacha, to bring the get all of the Isha, it's too much of a bother for him. And on the other hand, she never appointed him as a shliach lekabbalah. Is therefore, even if the shliach now decides, all right, you know what, I'll bring the get, I'll get her on a train and I'll bring her the get, she's not megureshes. Because at the moment that the get reached his hands, he objected to becoming a shliach leholacha. And that has nothing to do at all with the suffix of whether b'dibur didaka samach, b'dibur dideka samach, and therefore says Rashi, in the scenario of Rabbi Nachman, there's no proof whatsoever. Now the Gemara is a kash on Rav Nachman from our Mishnah. Rav Huna bar Chia Toshma. HaOmer, the Mishnah says that if a person says to a shliach, "His kabel get zeli ishti," or "Holech get zeli ishti," Rotzel lachzor, yachzor. In other words, the Baal could not appoint the shliach as a shliach lekabbalah. Only the ish has an authority to do so, and therefore, the best that the Baal could do is appoint the shliach as a shliach lo halacha, and therefore she's not megureshes until she receives the get, and he could be choser bo before that. Taima, the Gemara is medayik the rotza, only because he decided lachsa. Otherwise, the get would be chal. Holo rotza havi get. V'amai, why should the get be chal? Habal la bar shavi shliach kabbalahu. The Baal doesn't have the authority to make the shliach into shliach lekabbalah. And what did the Baal say to the shliach? He said, his kabel get zeli ishti. And his kabel get zeli ishti means that he's not a shliach lo halacha, but rather shliach lekabbalah. And if he's a shliach lekabbalah, well, that's a problem because she never appointed him as a shliach lekabbalah. The Baal doesn't have the authority to do so. So even if lo ratza lachzabo, the get should be invalid. Because again, the Baal only has the rights to create a shliach l'cholach, not a shliach l'kabbalah. So why does the Mishnah imply that if he wasn't choser bo, then the get would be chal? Meaning, if let's say the get reached her hands, obviously the get is valid. Why? She didn't appoint him as a shliach l'Kabbalah, and he doesn't have the power to appoint him as a shliach l'Kabbalah, and therefore his minui shlichus is batul mevutal. Ella, says Gemara, the only way we can understand the underlying logic of the Mishnah is the Amrina. Once he has decided to be his wife, then he wants to get to be chal in any way possible. And when he finds out that he doesn't have the authority to be mana a shliach l'Kabbalah, that's in her court, not in his. Therefore, he is very happy and satisfied that the shliach should be a shliach l'olacha. And therefore, once the get reaches the hands of the Isha, he cannot be choser bo, and the get is valid because it was brought to her by his shliach l'olacha, even though he had said his kabel get zel yodi. So therefore, hachinami, when we go back to Rav Nachman's case, when she said havali giti, which means that she appointed the shliach la'ava, and yet the shliach misrepresented himself to the Baal, and he said ishtecha omra is kabali giti, is why does Rav Nachman say that the get is completely null and void? Because the Baal never appointed this shliach as a shliach lo'olacha, but rather relied upon the presentation of the shliach when he said that your wife said is kabali gite. Why not apply our rule that we derive from our Mishnah that came in Shenosan Edav L'Garsha Meimama Tigarish Kol Heichdim Garsha, and he has this open-minded kind of ratzon to create a shliach in a way that the shliach will be effective, and therefore, since the shliach in this case cannot be a shliach le-Kabbalah because she never appointed him as such, then he should become a shliach le-Holacha because the Baal has this ratzon, his das, to be megarisha. Now, I'm not sure what he says over here. It confuses me. Just one second. Af sheba'osa sholo nasa shliach holacha. I don't know what he means by that. I guess that, again, the language here of the Masechet is a little bit unclear, in my opinion. I think he means to say, he doesn't say it explicitly, that although the Baal never appointed the Shliach as a Shliach Laholacha, insofar as he relied on the presentation of the Shliach, but nevertheless, since we have a principle of Tigarish Kol Heichet Garsha, he should become a Shliach Laholacha. Which means that if he wants to be choser bo after the shliach already delivered the get to the isha, it should not be chal. His chazor would not be chal, and she would be megureshes. So that's the Gemara's kasha against Rav Nachman. Hachiyash, Gemara answers the following: Chasam in our Mishnah, the Mishnah is not predicated on the principle of Tigarish Kol Heichdim Garsha, but rather Adam Yodesh in Shlichus LeKabbalah v'Gomer L'Shem Olacha. A man knows that he cannot appoint a Shliach LeKabbalah. That's public knowledge, and therefore he decided that this Shliach should be a Shliach L'Olacha. He said his Kabel. He meant to say his Kabel v'Holech. But Hach, in the case of Rab Nachman, where the shliach fabricated the presentation that the Isha said to him, the Baal thinks that he could rely on the shliach. The shliach says that she had appointed him, the shliach, as a shliach l'Kabbalah. So therefore, he never had kavanah to appoint the shliach as a shliach lo halacha. Omar Rav Toshma. Rav has a kasha on Rav Nachman from a Mishnah later on Daf Samachei Ktana Sha'omras Kabali Gittin. So the father was Makabel Kiddushin for his Bas Ktana, and she's Mikudeshes Min HaTorah, and now she appoints a shliach to be Makabel HaGet. Eino get ad she'agia get liyada. In other words, a Ktana does not have the ability to appoint a shliach. And therefore, if the Baal appoints the shliach as a shliach, then fine, the shliach serves the shliach leholacha. So Gemara's medayik. Ki bata giti liyada miya megarsha. At least based on the minya Baal of a shliach leholacha. Once she receives the get, she's megureshes. Frek the Gemara v'amai. Why is the Gerushin Chal when the get reaches her hand? V'alav shliach lo lacha shavya. The Baal never made her into a shliach lo lacha. He gave her the get al das shehi shliach kabbalah. And I'm assuming now that the Gemara thinks that in the Baal's mind, it's not public knowledge, the Baal mistakenly thought that she as a Ketana could appoint a shliach le kabbalah. Ella, we have to derive the conclusion that Amrina, we have a principle of and therefore he wants to appoint the shliach as a shliach leholacha because she, the Ketana, could not appoint the shliach as a shliach lekabbalah. Is hachinami. Why don't we say the same thing in Rav Nachman's frame of reference when she appointed a shliach leholacha and the shliach presents himself as a shliach lekabbalah, and the Baal says, "Hey, l'kamosha amra." Even if we say the svara that the Baal relies on the shliach, or al dilma, if we say the svara that we had before of ka'akri l'shlichu, so in this case we should apply the principle kol hecha de megarsha, and if that be the case, then he is appointing the shliach as a shliach leholacha. So Gemara says, "Hachi hashta." You cannot accept that analogy. Hasam there in the Mishnah of Yodei Shein Shlichus Lekatan. The government Nasan L'Shem Halacha Didei. He definitely appointed the shliach as a shliach lolacha because he understood very well that the shliach could not be appointed by the Ketana to serve as a shliach le Kabbalah. But hacha here in the case where the shliach mistakenly relies on the presentation of the when the Baal, relies on the presentation of the shliach, toy, the Baal made a big mistake, and he mistakenly thinks that she, the Isha, had appointed this shliach the shliach lekabbalah. Memela, he never had in mind to be memana the shliach the shliach lolocha toshma. We have another kash on Rav Nachman from a brisa. A woman says to shliach havi li gite, and the Baal. And the shliach presents himself to the Baal as Ishchamers Kabbalah Gittin. So she never appointed the shliach Kabbalah, and the shliach misleads the Baal to thinking that he was appointed shliach Kabbalah. Now the Bryce has the opposite scenario. She said that the shliach is Kabbalah Gittin. She appointed the shliach Kabbalah. And the shliach misrepresented himself. I should be a shliach leholacha v'hu amar, and he said to the shliach, "Helech, holech, v'seila, zachilas, kabbalah, is ratza lachzar yachzar, but mishagili get liyada megureshes." So we're going to see how to interpret this brisa in just a minute. But basically, this brisa presents a kasha on Rav Nachman, a steer to Rav Nachman, because the brisa says that the get will be chal, albeit when it reaches her hands, and that's against Rav Nachman. My love, Kabbalah, Kabbalah, v'lo. In the first case, the shliach said, misrepresentative said, and he said that she appointed me as a shliach le Kabbalah, and the Baal said Zechila his Kabbalah. All right, that's called Kabbalah a Kabbalah. In the second case, the Shliach said, misrepresenting the Isha, he said that I was appointed by the Isha as a Shliach lo lach. The Baal said holech v'tein lo. Right, there were three options here in this brisa. There was holech v'tein lo, and then there was chila v'skabbalah. So we're saying now that chila v'skabbalah is referring to a case of Kabbalah. Just 1 second. I made a mistake and I said the brisa is misrepresentation. Maybe not. Just 1 second. Let me just go over this one more time. So many different cases and variations. Yeah, I was right. Yeah, the shliach is misrepresenting the Isha to the Baal. Okay, so now let's ask the kasha on Rav Nachman according to the Havmin of the Gemara that we're studying right now of Kabbalah, V'aloch, Aloch. And we go back to the Reish of the Brisa. The shliach said that he's a shliach Kabbalah. The Baal gave the get Almanas Ken based on the assumption that Shliach was telling him the truth and she appointed him as Shliach LeKabbalah. And the proof of the pudding is because he said to the Shliach these two magic words, his Kabbalah. So even though the Baal does not have the authority to appoint the Shliach LeKabbalah, but she had appointed the Shliach as a Shliach LeKabbalah. And the Baal accepted him as such. And yet the Brisa says that when the get reaches our hand, she's megureshes. And why is that? Because, again, we're going back to that principle of kol hechne megarsha. And that's against Rav Nachman. So the Baal said is kabli, b'loshen kabbalah, and yet we're going to interpret it as if he had appointed the shliach as a shliach leholacha, even though his lashon was indicative of shliach as lekabbalah, and therefore mishigia get liyada megureshes, and that's against Rav Nachman, because if his das was explicitly expressed as you be a shliach lekabbalah, and yet we're going to say no. He appoints his shliach leholacha because kol hechad megarsha megarsha. How much more so in the case of Rav Nachman, when the Baal said Hela Kamosha Amra, and we could interpret that he's not relying on the shliach, but rather on the Isha, who said Havali Gita be a shliach leholacha, and therefore the get should certainly be chal when it comes to our hands. And why did Rav Nachman paska that she's not megureshes? And the Gemara says lo. We're not going to accept your interpretation of the Brisa Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Alocha, but rather Kabbalah, Alocha, V'olocha, Kabbalah. So in the first case, when the Shliach says, this is Kabbalah, right? Ishtecha Amra his Kabbalah Gittin. The Baal responded, because we're saying now Kabbalah aholacha, and he said holech v'tein, a lashon of holacha. In the second case, the shliach said, Ishtecha amra haveli gite. I am a shliach loloch, and the Baal said zechila is Kabbalah, lashon Kabbalah. That's not difficult, according to Rav Nachman, Because the reason why in the ratio the get is valid when it reaches our hands is because the Baal explicitly appointed the get as a shliach leholacha, because we're going with holacha Kabbalah, and he said holech v'tein or some other lashon of holacha. So the shliach was satisfied with serving as a shliach leholacha. In contrast, Rav Nachman's case, where the Baal said Halech Moshe Amra, maybe he had kavana to accept the presentation of the shliach who said that that this shliach, I am a shliach lekabbalah. Again, we didn't get to the seifa of halacha kabbalah. That's going to come right around the bend. But now let's focus on kabbalah halacha. And the Gemara raised the following kasha: I kabbalah aholacha michimati gita liyade lialta avi gita. If it's a case of kabbalah aholacha, which means that the shliach was appointed as a shliach lekabbalah, just 1 second. And not only that, but in the Reisha, the Baal said is Kabbalah Gita. So everything should be fine and dandy. She appointed the Shliach as a Shliach Kabbalah. The Baal used the language of Shliach Kabbalah. Now we have to chart this out on the board, right? The Shliach says that he was appointed as Shliach Kabbalah. The Baal says Holech v'tein. Just 1 second. Here it says Abal Omolo Iskabel Gita. Just 1 second. Oh, he's referring to the Sefer. Now, why is he referring to the Sefer when it says Kabbalah Aholacha? So this is definitely going on the Sefer. Okay, so Kabbalah Aholacha is referring to the Sefer. So the Shliach says that I was appointed as a Shliach L'Holacha, but the Baal uses the language of Kabbalah, and he says it's Kabbalah. That's called Kabbalah Holacha in the Sefer. And in fact, truth be told, that she had appointed the Shliach as a Shliach L'Kabbalah. It was the Shliach who made a shinui, and he said, Havi li Gita. So in such a case, since she appointed him as a Shliach L'Kabbalah, the Baal explicitly appointed him as a Shliach L'Kabbalah, then immediately when the get reaches our hands, the Gerushin should be Chal. And yet the Brisa says the Gerushin is only Chal when the get reaches our hands. Shma Minah. We have to derive the conclusion that if you're interpreting this Brisa as Kabbalah Holacha v'Holacha al Kabbalah, then Adibur Didei Kasam. The Baal relies on the words of the Shliach. The Shliach said in the Sefer, Ishtecha Omra Havi Li Gite, and the Baal is not going to assume Adibur Dida, and she appointed him as a Shliach LeKabbalah, but rather Dibur Didei. And if it's Dibur Didei, and he's relying on the Shliach, then he appoints the Shliach as a Shliach L'Holacha. Yeah, but the Baal said his Kabbalah. No, his Kabbalah of a Holech, he means. Okay. So in any event, we have a proof from this brisa regarding the original suffix in the Gemara in the case where the shliach changes the dibur of the isha, and he says to the Baal, Heilek Moshe Am, and the Baal says to the shliach, Heilek Moshe Amra, and he's going to be somech on the divrei shliach, and therefore, since the shliach presented himself as a shliach leholacha, therefore the get will be chal when it reaches our hands. So Gemara rejects this. Hachi hashta. You cannot equate the brisa to our suffix. Why hasam in the suffix dika amr la? When the Baal said to the shliach Heilek Moshe Amra, and here we're vacillating whether or not he's relying on what the Isha said to the shliach, and therefore he said Moshe Amra. But hach in the Sefer of the Brisa, Mika Amrla, did the Baal say to the shliach Heilek Moshe Amra? We don't have that. All we know is he said is Kabel La. And if we assume that he knows, and it's a double push to everyone that he cannot appoint a shliach lekabbalah, then for sure he meant his Kabel V'holech La, as the shliach had presented himself in the name of the Isha of Haveli Gittin. And that's why the get, when it reaches the hands of the Isha, is chal. But in a case where he says Heilek Moshe Amra, maybe he's not somech on the shliach, but rather he means to say I'm somech on what the Isha said, and she appointed him as a shliach lekabbalah. The Baal therefore thought he was giving the get to a shliach kabbalah, and he never appointed. Just 1 second. Right, and he didn't appoint the shliach as a shliach lekabbalah. I'm sorry, as a shliach le'olacha, but rather he said his kabbalah k'moshe amra. K'moshe amra means that he's a shliach lekabbalah. Therefore, the get is chal immediately when it reaches the hands of the shliach. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the brisa, and now we're going back to the sugya of holek is chidami. A woman says to her shliach is kabel li giti, and then the shliach repeats what he heard from the isha. Ishtacha Amra is Kabali Giti, but who Omer the Baal says, Holech v'tein o zachilo, or his kabel Ratzalachsalo Yachsal. Now again, if he said his kabel, right, his kabbalah, fine. I understand that both she and he, the husband and wife, agree that the shliach is kabbalah, and if he can be chosba, but in the cases of holech v'teila or zachila, so that should depend upon whether holech is chidam. But the Tanakama here holds that holech is zachik, his chila, and therefore, even though he said holech, what he meant to say was that you should serve as a shliach lekabbalah. Rabbi Nosson Omer holech v'teila. So Baal said the shliach holech v'teila. So it means that Rabbi Nosson disagrees with Tanakama. He holds that holech lav kischidam, and this Kabbalah rotzalachsa or loyachsa. But in the case where he said beferish, I want you to serve as shliach Kabbalah as you were appointed by the Isha, then the get is chal immediately. Now Rebbe is going to repeat what we saw in the name of the Tanakama. Rebbe omer b'kulon im rotzalachsa loyachsa. Rebbe holds that holech is kischidam. But if he says, I don't want this shliach to serve as a shliach kabbalah, ella holech v'tein, he adds the words v'tein, then we don't apply the principle of holech kischidami and rotzalachsa yachs. In fact, the Gemara Rebbe Hainu Tanakama, isn't he just simply repeating what the Tanakama said? And the Gemara answers in two different directions. Number one, he's coming to tell you that if he adds the words efshi, shetekabel la, then when he says holech v'tein, so again, we're holding Rebbe agrees to the Tanakama that holech kizchidami. But in a case, Rebbe says, where he said, the efshis to Kabbalah, I don't want him to be a shliach l'Kabbalah, but holech v'tein, then he could be chosba. V'bais ema. Let's answer the Divrei HaKamashmon. What is Rebbe coming to teach us? Man Tanakama Rebbe. The Brisa just adds Rebbe to tell you that Tanakama is Rebbe. Iboilahu, we have a suffix, Halech l'Rabbi Nasan, Kizchi Dami, Olav Kizchi Dami. A woman says to a shliach, his Kabbalah Gittin. And the shliach said exactly that to the Baal. And the Baal says, Halech Haget. Now Rabbi Nasan holds that Holech Lav Kizchi Dami. But in this case, he didn't say Holech with a Vav, but rather he said Halech. Halech means, here it is, it's yours. And Kizchi Dami, it's as if immediately you are Zocha in the get on behalf of the Isha, and you're serving as a Shliach l'Kabbalah, and he cannot be Chosub. Or should we say no? That since Rabbi Nasan holds Holech Lav Kizchi Dami, then Halech is also Lav Kizchi Dami. And it means he should be Molech again. So the Gemara is now going to be Medayik from the Reisha of our Mishnah that even according to Rabbi Nasan, Halech Kizchi Dami. Rabbi Nasan concedes in the case of Halech as opposed to Holech. Toshma, I'll prove it to you from the Reisha of our Mishnah. Ha'omer man says to Shlichus Kabbalah, get Zela Ishti, oh, Holech, get Zela Ishti. In Ratzalachsa Yachzor, as long as the get has not come to our hands, he could be Choser Bo. Because the Baal does not have the ability to appoint a Shliach LaKabbalah, but only a Shliach LaHolach. And therefore the get will only be Chal when she gets the get into her hands. But Ha'isha Sha'amra is Kabbalah Gittin. So again, in the first case, the Baal said his Kabbalah get Zela Ishti. In the second case, the Isha said his Kabbalah Giti. So she appointed a Shliach as a Shliach LeKabbalah, and the Baal responded by saying, his Kabel or Holech right, so I understand the case of Iskabel because then the Baal agrees that he's a Shliach LeKabbalah, but what about the case of a Holech? Because Holech is Chidam. Right, so the Mishnah seems to accept the Shita of the Tanakh and Rebbe that Holech is Chidam. So we're going to turn now to Daf Samach Gimel, and we're going to have a different shot.